Hello, and welcome to Fest Forward Advisor Talks, brought to you by Ottawa Festival Network, a not-for-profit service organization that works cooperatively with members and partners towards a vibrant, inspired, and prosperous festival capital. In this podcast series, industry experts break down hot topics in the operational and strategic areas of focus that are essential for any festival and event organization. You will hear best practices and expert advice, complemented by real-world examples and lessons learned from fellow festival producers that will help you solve problems, make decisions, and realize your creative visions. In this episode, our advisor is Benjamin Miller, a staff lawyer with Community Legal Education Ontario, or CLEO, where he focuses on the legal needs of nonprofits and charities. Over the past 5 years at CLEO, Benjamin has answered hundreds of nonprofit law questions and developed an online interactive bylaw builder for the ONCA. Benjamin also works at the Ontario Nonprofit Network and has worked at the Canada Revenue Agency in the past. Benjamin holds a JD and MPP from the University of Toronto and an MA in Political Theory from the University of Ottawa. Benjamin provides us with a comprehensive breakdown of the key differences and legal considerations for how to structure your organization. The information he presents is valuable to help you determine what makes the most sense for your organization and its goals. So whether you are just starting up a brand new festival organization or looking to restructure to something more effective, this episode will help equip you with the information you need to make the best decisions. Thank you to the Canada Council for the Arts and their support for the making of this podcast. Enjoy this episode, and please like, share, and subscribe to support this series.
Hello, as you heard, my name is Benjamin Miller. I'm a staff lawyer on the Nonprofit Law Ontario project of Community Legal Education Ontario, a legal clinic part of Ontario's legal aid system that provides free, plain language legal information on a range of topics, including nonprofit law. I'm also a policy advisor at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, an independent network for Ontario's 58,000 nonprofits and charities advocating for a more enabling environment for nonprofits to pursue public benefit. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about choosing whether or not to incorporate, and then if you've chosen to incorporate, how to incorporate as a business, as a nonprofit, as a co-op. What do charities have to do with any of this? I'm going to go over the pros and cons of incorporating, and then the pros and cons of incorporating under different structures, what the differences between them are. Now, a few disclaimers, as I am a lawyer, and lawyers are wont to give disclaimers. I have not one, but 4 disclaimers for you today. The first one is that all of this is general legal information. It isn't legal advice tailored to your specific situation. That's not because I don't want to give advice, but because I can't give advice effectively without knowing the ins and outs of the way you operate, what your purposes are, what your goals and environment are, who your supporters are, etc. So all of this is intended as general context to help you set up and understand the choices involved, but it isn't advice in particular for you. Secondly, this is a high-level overview of corporate law. It isn't comprehensive, and it doesn't address all areas of relevant law, such as charity law, if you're interested in becoming a charity, or copyright, if your brand is very important to you and protecting that is very important. There are many other areas of law which may have an impact on how you work and your decision on how to structure yourself. We are just talking about corporate law today. Thirdly, I will be discussing law, not best practices. And as I like to say, just because something is legal doesn't mean it's a good idea. You've got your business, you've got your operations day to day, and those will, to a large extent, incorporate considerations far beyond the law. Personal relationships, histories, changing trends, community, changes in the community, etc. All those things may factor into a decision about who you are as an organization and how you'll operate. They go well beyond the law, well beyond any expertise I might be able to offer as a lawyer. So keep that in mind. This is just one narrow part of the broader question of who you may choose to be as an organization. And then finally, this is about law. It's not about your funder's expectations. So the law generally establishes minimums. It establishes structures that you might choose to make use of. So I'll be highlighting options for you. But then your funders, and by funder, I mean they could be your sponsors, they could be government funders, they could be your customers, they could be your clients, your donors. All these individuals or organizations can have different expectations about what kind of organization you are that might determine their funding decisions. So that can be really important to your choices, as we'll discuss later. I don't know what your funder's expectations are, and so that's another important factor to consider that we won't cover in this presentation. So the first thing to note is, before you've incorporated, what are you? There are two basic questions you might want to ask yourself. Firstly, are you an individual operating alone? You might have other people helping you out, but ultimately, are they answering to you? Are you the sole decision maker at the top? Or are you two or more people coming together, making a decision about a group? If you are an individual, you may already be a sole proprietorship, meaning you don't need to go register with any government office to be operating as a sole proprietorship. You may want to, for example, get a master business license if you choose to operate in a for-profit way. You may want to register the name of your organization if you go by a different name than your personal name. Those are all choices you can do, but if you don't do it, it doesn't mean that you aren't a sole proprietorship. If you are two or more people who are working together, then the question is, do your purposes include making a profit? And here's the first myth that I want to address. Some people think that a profit means taking money in. So nonprofits aren't allowed to take any money in. They're not allowed to have any revenue. That's not the case. Some people think profit means, well, do people get paid? And that's closer to the truth, but that's still not quite right. Nonprofits can pay people. They can have employees, they can have contractors. The difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit organization, and we'll talk about a few different kinds today, the difference is as follows. A for-profit organization is owned by somebody, and whoever owns the organization has a right to collect dividends. Basically, if there is a surplus, if you have revenue that's above your expenses, that surplus could be reinvested in the business, or it can be distributed to the owners in what are called dividends. That's a for-profit organization. A nonprofit organization is not allowed to distribute surpluses. So you can pay people for the work they do and for what they contribute, but nobody has a right in a nonprofit to collect surplus just by virtue of their control of the nonprofit. That's the big difference. So if two or more people get together and one of their goals is to distribute to the owners any surplus you happen to make, what we're calling profit, that may be a partnership for legal purposes, and it can be subject to the Partnerships Act and the Limited Partnerships Act, depending on the agreement between those two individuals. You don't necessarily need to sign an agreement calling yourselves partners, although that can be a factor. You don't even need to use the word partners. If you're coming together to pursue an enterprise with one of your purposes being profit, it may not be your only purpose. You may also want to benefit the community and so on. But if one of your purposes is profit, you may be a partnership. And so all of a sudden, the rules that govern how you relate to each other falls under partnership law. That's something to be aware of. You don't need to sign up anywhere. Now, if your purposes don't include profit, meaning you're out there to put on a good arts event or to put on a good cultural event or to put on some kind of celebration, some kind of festival, and you're not really in it to collect any surplus at the end of the day. Sure, you might like to be paid for the work you put in, but at the end of the day, it's not about collecting dividends. Well, this kind of coming together is called an unincorporated association. Again, You don't need to sign up anywhere. You don't need to file anything with the government. You may already be considered an unincorporated association if you are two or more people coming together for purposes other than profit. Now, on the Nonprofit Law Ontario website, you can find a page called Unincorporated Associations that goes through the list of questions you might want to answer in your constitution or your governing rules or the agreement that all the members of your group agree to. This can be a great idea to clarify things like how are decisions made? Who has a right to the property of the association? What happens if the association decides we're not putting on the festival next year? Where does the property go, etc. Right? So before you even get to the stage of deciding whether or not to incorporate, it can be really important to pay attention to what's your current legal status and do you have the proper agreements and constitutions in place to define your rights and rules for how you make decisions now. That's the first thing I want to highlight. Okay, so you've come to the question of should we incorporate or not? What are the pros and cons? Okay, so let's imagine a festival. Let's call it an X festival. So it's a festival dedicated to celebrating X, the letter X. So there's a beautiful calligraphy show. People dress up as X. People have spelling bees for words exclusively spelled with the letter X, etc. It's a great festival. Everybody loves it. Okay, and it's been around a few years. And someone asked, should we incorporate? Okay, so what are the factors? Well, number one of the benefits of incorporating is protection from liability. So let's say, God forbid, one day a giant X falls on one of your patrons and hurts them. Who gets sued? Well, in an unincorporated association or a sole proprietorship or a partnership, the only people who exist, the only people who are liable, who are responsible for what the festival does, are the individuals themselves. So that might mean the executive committee, that might mean the membership, that might mean the owner, the partners, right? Those individuals are personally liable. When an organization becomes incorporated, that corporation becomes its own legal person. And so who gets sued? Well, first and foremost, the corporation gets sued and not necessarily the individuals, although they may be individually sued if they don't fulfill their obligations. So it's not a complete shield from all liability, but a corporation is intended to protect the individuals from liability. The corporation gets sued, not them personally. That's one of the big pros of incorporating. The second pro, so this X Festival is great. There are lots of people who are involved left, right, and center in various ways, volunteers, people who are paid, some people aren't. However, there's a lot of turnover year to year. This is something a lot of organizations face. The community wants this X Festival to be going on, for another 100 years. Well, one way to help guarantee this continuity is to become incorporated. The corporation does not depend on the involvement of any particular people. It continues to exist even after everyone who founded it, everyone who's involved, left. The corporation carries on, and the positions within the corporation can be filled by others. Number 3, a clear legal framework. So an unincorporated association or a partnership or a sole proprietorship, one of the benefits of any of these forms is that you've got lots of flexibility in what you want your rules to be. So let's say the X Festival has a very particular way of making decisions. You have to mark X on all the ballots, etc., right? They have a very specific way of making decisions, and they're worried that if they become incorporated, all these rules and so on that corporate law imposes will not allow them to have their special way of making decisions. That's quite possible. But let's imagine the X Festival couldn't care less about coming up with all these governance rules. They just want to do the work of celebrating X's. Well, it can be very helpful to become incorporated and then somebody tells you, here are the basic rules. Particularly under Ontario's Not-for-Profit Corporations Act and under the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, there are a lot of default rules. So even if you say nothing in your governing documents, there are going to be rules that apply. So you don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. That's one of the advantages of incorporating. And then finally, and probably one of the biggest ones for organizations just starting out, is eligibility for funding. There are many funders, government funders, private funders, even sponsors who only fund corporations, only fund incorporated entities. The reason they do this is they have a bit more assurance that the organization isn't just going to disappear, because remember, it has permanent legal existence, that it's not just going to get up and walk away. Remember, it's the corporation who's sued if there's any issue. So this provides some security to funders. Okay, so those are some of the main benefits to incorporation. What are the cons? Well, number one, it's more paperwork. Firstly, you have to file articles of incorporation. Secondly, you need to come up with a governing set of rules. Many of the rules are already set out, but not all of them. And the default rules may not be appropriate for you. So coming up with a set of bylaws that make sense for your organization is also a big part of incorporating. There's cost involved. There's a basic fee of a few $100s to incorporate. And then if you choose to work with an organization or a lawyer or a consultant, it can be quite a bit more, at least a few thousands, depending on how customized you want your organization to be. And then I've already mentioned this con, but it's a more rigid legal framework. So you might like the flexibility. So that's something to keep in mind. All right, let's say you've decided to incorporate and you're looking at different kinds of corporations. Well, let's look at two most common kinds of corporations: business corporations versus nonprofit corporations. So the first difference between business and nonprofits is that businesses can pursue any purpose they want. One of the purposes is going to be making a profit. Remember, that means making a surplus, having more revenue than expenses, and then being able to distribute that surplus to the owners. The owners are called shareholders. Nonprofits don't have shareholders. They have what are called members. The members do not own the nonprofit. They control the nonprofit. If you are an individual who's starting out and you're worried about starting a nonprofit because someone is going to take control away from you, that's not necessarily the concern, because nonprofit corporations, just like businesses can have sole shareholders, nonprofit corporations can have sole members, and the sole member exercises almost complete exclusive control of the organization. It's very hard to take an organization away from a sole member. So you can retain control, but the difference is the controller of a nonprofit is not a shareholder. They're not entitled to dividends. That's really the difference between the two. The legal responsibility of directors is different between businesses and nonprofits. Corporate law tells us that usually directors are accountable to the shareholders for the bottom line of the organization. At the end of the day, one of the purposes is to make a profit, and if they fail to do so, they may be shirking their responsibilities. Nonprofit directors have more holistic objectives to balance the interests of the community, of the accomplishing the purposes of the nonprofit, respecting different parts, stakeholders in the community. So it is the kind of accountability of the board is different in a nonprofit than it is in a business. This might be really important for you if you draw a lot of your support from the community and you want to remain accountable to that community. Businesses and nonprofits are not eligible for the same kind of funding, which can be really important. Now, another advantage of nonprofits over businesses is that they're tax exempt. However, to remain tax exempt, they are restricted in their revenue earning to breaking even, plus they're able to generate a reasonable reserve. beyond a reasonable reserve, and Canada Revenue Agency may come and say, you're operating like a business, we're going to tax you like a business, even though you're a nonprofit corporation. So those are some of the differences between businesses and nonprofits. Now, you may have heard the term nonprofit and charity, and you're wondering, what do these two things have to do with each other? A nonprofit has to do with the corporate status of your organization. Whether or not you are a registered charity has to do with your tax status, in particular, your ability to issue tax receipts, and until very recently, your ability to receive funding directly from other charities like foundations. So, a charity is a more specific kind of nonprofit corporation or a trust. The key thing about a charity is that its purposes has to fit into four categories: relief of poverty, so think like food banks; advancement of education, so think like libraries; advancement of religion, churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., and other purposes beneficial to the community. Can festivals be charities? Yes, they can be charities, but not all festivals are eligible to be charities. If you're interested in becoming a registered charity, you have to be a nonprofit. That's the first thing to note. You can go to the Canada Revenue Agency Charities website, and they have a page specifically dedicated to festivals and when they might qualify under, for example, advancement of education or promotion of the arts. As I mentioned, a registered charity can issue tax receipts and receive money from other registered charities. The rules have changed recently so that even non-registered charities can receive money from registered charities, but there's a bit more uncertainty around that framework right now. Registered charities have more flexible revenue earning rules than nonprofits. So as I mentioned, nonprofits can earn, in order to remain tax exempt, can earn a break-even point plus a reasonable reserve. Charities have no upper limit really to the amount that they can earn if what they're charging for is either their charitable activities or what's called a related business. You can look up on the Canada Revenue Agency website what a related business is, but the point is registered charities can earn much more surpluses. They're not allowed to distribute those surpluses to shareholders, but they can certainly pay employees, they can pay contractors, etc. Registered charities are subject to a lot more paperwork and a lot more oversight by the Canada Revenue Agency and the Ontario Public Guardian and Trustee than are regular nonprofits, and it's because charities have extraordinary tax benefits tied to them. So that's something to be careful of. The key thing to think about when asking yourself what kind of structure do we want is, who at the end of the day do you want to be in charge of the organization, and who do you want to be benefiting from the organization and how? If you or others in the organization want to be earning dividends, for profit is the way, nonprofit is not an appropriate model. If you're interested in maintaining control of the organization and you maybe want to get a salary from the organization, but it's okay if you're not paid dividends, then nonprofit is possible. And there are a range of different ways that you can structure the membership of your organization. One way of structuring the membership is being completely open. Basically saying anybody who supports our festival can be a member of the organization. This is great as a way to be appealing to a wide audience. Membership can be a way to raise revenues. You can charge a membership fee, for example. On the flip side, members have certain rights in the organization, and it can be difficult to manage this membership just logistically, and also it can lead to disagreements over how the organization's run. Semi-open membership is where you say it's open to anyone, but there are certain conditions on who can be a member. For example, They have to sign a code of conduct. They have to agree to confidentiality, etc. You can be very creative in how you define conditions of membership. This can be a happy medium between being open and inclusive, but still kind of guarding who you want to have control of the organization at the end of the day. Self-perpetuating board is where the board members, and there's, if you incorporate provincially, there's a minimum requirement of 3, and if you incorporate federally, there's a minimum requirement of 1, unless you receive a lot of donations or funding from the public above $10,000. The self-perpetuating board model is where that core group of people are the only members, so that they can elect others to replace themselves, but they remain in control of the organization while they're the board. Single member, I mentioned earlier, it's similar to a corporation that's owned by one person. The single member elects the board, so even though there's a board of 3, that board is ultimately answerable to the individual member. And that member is their sign off is needed for major decisions like changes to the bylaws, sales of major assets, mergers, changes to the names, changes to the purposes of the organization, etc. Hybrid members is where you have some members who can vote, so they have effective control of the organization, and some members who can't vote. So you can get very creative in ways to include different stakeholders in your community without necessarily giving up control of the organization. And then finally, there are representative member models where the members are individuals who are elected by broader groups. So let's say your festival covers a large area or many neighborhoods, and the different neighborhoods want to have representation at the festival decision-making body. Well, membership can be set up where those neighborhoods elect individuals who then come to the members' meeting and vote on important things. Another option for an organization just starting out is working with what's called a shared platform. So this is where the festival remains unincorporated, but it works with an entity which is incorporated, and that incorporated entity provides kind of back-end services. So they might manage the finances, they might provide some administrative support, they might even provide a workspace, and so on. The relationship between the festival and the shared platform becomes different if it decides to incorporate. You can still have that kind of supportive relationship between two corporations, but it's slightly different if one is a charity and one isn't. So that's something to keep in mind if this uh, model interests you. So thank you so much for listening. You can find more information about incorporating as a nonprofit under Ontario law on nonprofitlaw.cleo.on.ca. And you can find information about, once you're incorporated, rules around your meetings, your board meetings, your members' meetings, who is a member, what rights they have, and so on. I wish you all the best in your journey as you grow as a festival and you select the model that is right for you. I'll end with this note, if you select a model which is not quite right for you, so let's say, for example, you've incorporated as a business when you want to be a nonprofit, or you've incorporated as a nonprofit and then you want to become a business, it becomes more complicated. It is possible to change the nature of a corporation from nonprofit to for-profit or for-profit to nonprofit, but there may be tax implications to this. You may want to think about what's going to happen to our name and our branding, who's going to control that, what's going to happen to the governance, who's going to remain in control among those who are in control of the organization now. That becomes much more complicated. Our website doesn't address that. And for those types of issues, it might be more appropriate to seek legal advice. And what our website does have is a directory of lawyers who work with nonprofits in Ontario. We don't vet or recommend any of them. We simply confirm that some part of their practice includes nonprofit law. So again, all the best on your journey growing as a festival. I hope you pick a legal structure that is conducive to the well-being of all in your community.
And that wraps up this episode of Fest Forward Advisor Talks, presented by Ottawa Festival Network. All of the resources and links mentioned throughout this episode will be available in the episode show notes, as well as transcriptions in both French and English. For information on OFN and its membership, please check us out online at ottawasfestivals.ca. If you have any questions or feedback on this podcast, you can email us at festforward@ottawafestivals.ca. Thank you so much for listening, and please remember to subscribe to Fest Forward Advisor Talks to catch future episodes, where we will dive into even more hot topics festival and event organizations need to know to support and grow their organizations. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your colleagues and friends and leave us a review. That's all for now. Stay tuned and stay festive.